So in the last Retvlog before Antorus comes out, at least on normal and heroic, what you're probably wondering is what are we going to do about tier sets and what are we going to do about legendaries in terms of which one should be upgraded first. And what about the nerfs midweek? Well, this is it. Blizzard have made their play now. We were waiting for it. I was waiting for it and waiting for it and waiting for it. They finally changed the tier sets. Not in the way I'd expected. I'd expected them to just swap around the 2-piece and the 4-piece because the 2-piece is really strong. So what they've chosen to do instead is to nerf the 2-piece. Don't go mad though. It's still going to be really good. In fact, it could actually work out pretty well depending on what sort of position you are in. So what I've done, first of all, let's look at the tier 21 sets and how we might want to integrate it with our tier 20. And I've run some sims. Now, what I did with these sims, don't worry about the DPS numbers. You might look to those and say, well, okay, I can do more damage than that. Yes, they're less damage than my gear currently is now. That's because I try to use a much more even keel set of gear, so it doesn't take account of the fact, for example, I have some Warforged and Titanforged pieces and sockets and all the rest of it. So what I use is a baseline piece of gear that we would use now, that we can get now, that doesn't include any Antorus gear, but it does include 4-piece tier 20. And what I did is I added to that 2-piece tier 21. Now that base set of gear included Whisper of the Nathrezim, the legendary cloak. So I removed the legendary cloak and I swapped it for Soul of the High Lord first of all, just to show you the general idea. And what I got from this was, this is pure patchwork by the way, 5-minute patchwork fight. 7% increase, and I've kept the item levels the same. You've got to bear in mind, of course, you might have access to much higher item level Antorus gear, which can also vary it. And of course, you can't ignore the factors, you know, which pieces of tier 21 you get because of the stats, and which pieces of tier 20 or other non-tier pieces that you're replacing. Again, the way the stats works can have an effect as well. That's why it's always important to sim it for yourself. But a 7% increase by just giving yourself 2-piece tier 21 as well as keeping 4-piece tier 20 instead of just having 4-piece tier 20. But the item level are kept the same, 930 for all of these pieces, which is the equivalent of Mythic for tier 21, but normal for tier 20, sorry, Mythic for tier 20, I apologise, and normal for tier 21. So, then what I did is said, well, I know just for numbers' sake, you know, Leadrins is going to be better than Soul of the High Lord, so I used it with Leadrins. You know, predictably the damage went up. So 8.5%. So what we're basically saying is Chain of Thrain with the Leadrin's Fury Unleashed, and you know, using your basic gear that you might have now, with just adding in those 2 pieces of tier 21, keeping the 4 pieces of tier 20, and you've got a roughly 8.5% damage increase. That is what the 2 set is doing for you. Okay? That's how powerful the 2 set is. So now, doesn't look that bad, does it? The fact that it was nerfed. We don't need to run to the hills. It was too powerful before. Well, I just thought it was too powerful for a 2 set and they should have moved to the 4 set. Whatever, they've done what they've done. Now, I played around with a few other sims as well just to see what's going on here. Like, for example, should we go to 4-piece tier 21 and just keep 2-piece tier 20? At the moment, just purely in terms of the set bonuses, it doesn't look like a good trade-off. It's actually a little less damage, not a lot less damage. It's a little less damage to be using the 4-piece tier 21 as opposed to the 4-piece tier 20. However, again, I will emphasize, if you're a mythic geared raid and you've got 930 plus pieces of tier 20, remember, even the heroic tier 21 is 945 at least. So it might well be 15 item levels higher, unless you've got Warforged or Titanforged with tier 20. You've got to bear that in mind. That's why you'll need to sim it for yourself at the time. If you're using raid bots to sim yourself, you may not be able to use that at the moment. I don't think that's quite working with the new set bonuses. You can use Simcraft, however. That's all fine. Obviously, when you're watching this, raid bots might well be fine with it. But certainly when it launches live, you should be able to use raid bots for that. And you just need to run a few quick things before you raid anyway. Then it's like, well, at what point might we want to start using the cloak again? Obviously, Whisper of the Nathrezim is completely out if you're wanting to use the 6 set bonus. At a certain point, the item level of the Antorus gear, unless you've been lucky and got like Titanforged pieces of tier 20, which you may do. I mean, I've got a 950 gloves, for example, which is actually not ideal stats, really. But 950, not sniffing at that. So But you might find that the item level starts to overtake quite rapidly, and we just move to just using 4 set tier 21 eventually, dropping the tier 20, even 2 set, and then maybe we start to think about the Legendary Cloak again. But how is this going to affect our stats? We've got a huge sea change now with stats. All the way through Legion, we have been used to the idea of Mastery lagging behind. They made changes relatively recently which pulled it closer again, but it's still a little behind. Now it's not. I mean, certainly Antorus, when you get the 2 set, this is very important. When you get the 2 set tier 21, your Mastery is going to be very, very desirable. Reason for this, even a 40% increase in your Judgment makes your Mastery much better, because Mastery affects Judgment more than our spenders. Judgment's going to be kicking in a load of damage now. We're going to be using it a lot more. Just in damage terms, it's going to be fantastic. Remember, it's holy damage, so when you're comparing it to something like, you know, Blade of Justice is physical, so we don't get all of the effect of that damage from it, because taking armor into account, Judgment does all its damage on the enemy. So it's going to be a very, very powerful ability. Not as powerful as it was going to be. Which means we want to put in a load of Mastery. So I'm not just going to say something silly like go and stack a load of Mastery. Always sim. Always sim. Just don't be surprised if you find that when you start simming pieces of gear, that the ones with lots of Mastery on it are starting to look a little bit tasty. This can, of course, mean that stat sticks of an appropriate item level can also look very nice indeed. Now, when you get your Mastery up above a certain level, again, don't ask me for a specific percentage. It depends on your gear, so you have to sim. You will find that Greater Judgment is better than Zeal, even on a pure single target fight. So there will come a point, and it's a relatively easy point to get to if you've got some of the high-end Tomb of Sargeras gear, or even when you've just been in Antorus for a few weeks and you start to pick up some of that gear. If you can get yourself a decent amount of Mastery, then you will find that Greater Judgment sims a bit higher. Now that basically means then you're going to take Greater Judgment for everything, because if it's going to be best for single target, you can bet your ass it's going to be best for other situations as well. I already use it a fair amount in Mythic Dungeons, especially where trash is more the focus. But here we're going to be using it on bosses. It's very likely, I mean, hold on to your hats, because of course Blizzard could tune various things after they've got their data from the normal and heroic week, just before Mythic comes out. But we could end up just using Greater Judgment for everything. That is very much on the cards. Now, if we do use Greater Judgment for everything, then there is the argument that that not just empowers Mastery as a stat for us, because that's the thing. I mean, Mastery is already going to look good just because of the 2 set, tier 21. Using Greater Judgment can only increase the value of Mastery still further. Feeds into each other. It could reduce the value of crit a little bit, but don't go overboard with this. Don't assume that crit is trash. Think about it this way. Why is crit going to be devalued? That's because Greater Judgment means that Judgment, when the target is above 50%, it's like a reverse execute, automatically crits. Okay? So any crit is valueless in that situation. But it's only affecting Judgment, not any. So all your other abilities will crit according to how much crit rate you've got. And also when the boss is below half health, then it's also affecting Judgment as well. So let's not blow things out of proportion. It just means that for roughly half the fight, if the sort of health is dropping off at an even rate, which is not always the case, then in that situation, crit's not as useful in the first half of the fight. Another thing to bear in mind is in terms of the nuances of fights, if you know full well that the first 50% health of a boss is largely irrelevant, you're not up against any DPS checks, where it really matters is the end part. There's a mad, frantic execute phase of the fight. Obviously, Greater Judgment may not be as useful. Sims may tell you that it's a bit better than, say, something like Zeal. Maybe it's not. Remember, you lose all the benefit of Greater Judgment on a pure single target boss if below 50% is actually where you need to be kicking out the main damage, if that's where it matters. So use your noodle a little bit in thinking about when to take certain talents. Now, with Legendaries, so what Legendaries we're going to be choosing? Well, of course, we've got another new kid on the block, and I'm not talking about Amonthul's Vision. Obviously, we'd all ideally like that, and that doesn't count towards our legendary limit either. So if you get that, you're using it. Simple as that. But Insignia of the Grand Army, a new legendary ring, which we can get via a quest to kill Argosiel Maker. So if you're going to get that in the first week, you can get that straight away. That buffs the Crucible traits. By Crucible traits, I mean specifically that second tier light and shadow traits that we get via the Netherlight Crucible. If your item level, or artifact level rather, is high enough to actually unlock them. Now, in a situation like this, how powerful that ring is depends entirely on your luck with getting those traits. If you've got 3 Torment the Weak traits, then that ring, you're using it. It's going to be BIS. No real argument about that. If you don't, but you have some good ones that are not far off it, sim it, because it may well still be a useful legendary to have. So it does entirely depend on those traits. Basically, it buffs them by 50%. How good that is does depend on those traits. Beyond that, in terms of which ones you want to upgrade first, because of course that isn't one you'd have to upgrade. Personally, I'm going to be upgrading Chain of Thrain and Liadrin's Fury Unleashed, because I'm going to be hoping to get 2 pieces of tier 21, which means I'd be expecting not to use the cloak, at least to begin with. So Chain of Thrain, Liadrin's Fury Unleashed, should be able to upgrade that in the first week. If you do everything, apparently you might be able to get 3 legendaries upgraded in the first week, and then you can, you know, go for whatever. Soul of the High Lord, you know, one of those things between Soul of the High Lord, Liadrin's Fury Unleashed. What I always say is this: relative pros and cons. You may well see a lot of people passing high with Soul of the High Lord. This is not uncommon with RNG items. Soul of the High Lord is one of those classic RNG situations. If you use it, on balance, it's not generally going to do as much damage as Liadrin's Fury Unleashed. Just the sims will show that. That's just an overall on balance thing. But when you're passing, you're sort of going for a bit of good luck, aren't you? If you get very lucky streaks, particularly at crucial periods of time, like when you've got Crusade going and things like that, or, you know, extra damage on the boss for some other reason, then of course it's going to do really well for you. But on other times when you're not so lucky, then it won't. So just bear that in mind if you're going to be looking at what legendaries people use that pass high. They're not necessarily playing the fight the same way you do, and of course that's not necessarily representative of the damage they're likely to do time after time after time. But if you are going to, you know, if you don't have Liadrin's Fury Unleashed, then Soul of the High Lord is also still pretty decent. That could well be a good one to go for as well. Whisper of the Nathrezim really just depends on whether you've got, how quickly you're going to get the really high item level Antorus gear, because yeah, there is going to come a point, if you've only got base tier 20, just 930 maximum, whatever it happens to be, then the item level jump up to Antorus gear is probably going to devalue that 2-set bonus at some time, for some people quicker than others. At that point, then Whisper of the Nathrezim may well be a good one for you again. Might depend on haste a little bit. We know how it works. With, you know, reasonably high haste, then of course you're more likely to be able to keep your buff going. With less haste, it's not as easy. That's all dependent on you. Try it out, see how it goes. But for me, I'm going to advise Chain of Thrain and Liadrin's Fury Unleashed at first. But the downside to Liadrin's Fury Unleashed, much like Chain of Thrain, is of course because it only does its benefit during Crusade. We're still using Crusade, of course. During Crusade, then that means if you're not getting best use out of Crusade, because for some reason you have to move out of combat, there's a lot of movement, or for whatever reason you're not able to do maximum damage during Crusade and the full duration of Crusade on a fight, you're getting much less value than Liadrin's and Chain of Thrain, which won't be, you know, detailed in a sim. You'll have to think about that yourself. In that situation, maybe you think about other legendaries. But the aim is always to try and make sure you can do your maximum damage during Crusade. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea about what you should be thinking of. I can anticipate a few questions people are going to be asking, but one of them is very likely to be, okay, so which tier 21 pieces do we want ideally? You know how it is. You need to sort of simply, you have to bear in mind your own pieces. So for example, like I said, I've got 950 gloves. That means I'm probably not going to be thinking that the gloves, because even the heroic gloves are 945, it's 5 item levels less. Might have better stats, but you know, so I might be better off with other pieces. Generally speaking, what we're looking at is the old-fashioned haste mastery thing. So the legs, for example, have haste mastery. That's likely to be a pretty good piece for you. but it does depend on what you've already got and what it will be replacing. I don't know what pieces you've got that are Titan Forged or got sockets, so it very much depends on you. Just sim it. Ultimately, just try and get what you can. Try and avoid replacing your best bits of tier 20 if you can. And those, if they're all on the same item level, are likely to be haste pieces, pieces with mastery on it. So I hope that was useful to you. I will, of course, be doing various update videos as we go into Antorus, assuming I can get a raid for that. So any questions you have about it or occur at any time, keep putting them in here. We will keep talking about this. There will be another live Ret Q&A at some point. We're likely to wait for a few weeks for that one, but at some point that's going to be coming as well. If you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like. Put some comments down below. That's really helpful. If this is the first time you've come across this channel, then subscribe as well for other content. If you want to see my other Ret Paladin videos, I've got various playlists. That includes the playlist for guides as well as this one, which is playlist for vlogs. And until next time, I'll see you later and have fun in Antorus.